Today we are going to talk about Cuba and more specifically the Cuban Revolution and how life is today. To begin, will you tell us about the main achievements of the Cuban Revolution?
Before I can discuss the main achievements of the Cuban Revolution, first I need to set a little background and history of exactly what it was and what it hoped to achieve. So, the Cuban Revolution sought to overthrow the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Led by Fidel Castro, the revolution finally succeeded in ousting Batista in the year 1958. Castro was the leader of the new Socialist Republic in Cuba until 2008. Focus of his role was on placing control of national industries such as education, health, and wealth distribution in the hands of the central government. Now, looking at education. Castro's illiteracy program funneled a large portion of the national budget into the improvement of education for the people of Cuba. Cuba abolished private schools and controlled the curriculum through the state to promote the collective education of its people. Following, university enrollment increased by 100% in the decades between 1958 and 68 after the revolution. Children ages 6 to 11 now currently have a 100% enrollment rate in school, and about 98% of those students then go on to begin the first grade. Another focus of this new regime was on health. Now in Cuba, there's an average life expectancy of 77.6 years, which is almost identical to the United States. Infant mortality rates, which were once at a rate of 37.3 deaths per 1,000 births in 1960, have now decreased drastically to a rate of 5.3 deaths per 1,000 births in 2006. This shows immense health impacts caused by the revolution still affecting today. In terms of recent news, Cuba is ahead of all other nations in terms of vaccination status against COVID-19. The state has also developed two vaccines of its own. Cuba has combined their efforts to increase health and education into a program to increase international solidarity between Latin American nations. The Latin America School of Medicine in Havana, Cuba, now offers free medical education for Latin Americans and U.S. students. This program shows Cuba's intent to provide the world with their improvements in both the fields of medicine and education. So, who benefits the most from the achievements of the Cuban Revolution? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. Benefits mostly impact the everyday Cubans living their everyday lives in Cuba. Without a doubt, the general population has achieved the greatest amount of success following the Cuban Revolution and are mainly the ones benefiting from the achievements in health, education, and international solidarity. Workers are happier right after the revolution based on a study done in 1963, and many workers viewed the revolution in a positive light. Many also say they prefer state-controlled education and health. Certainly, the everyday lives of ordinary Cubans have improved through the removal of illiteracy and an incredible increase in promoting the health of its citizens. This is not to say that things are ideal, as there are issues such as lack of equality, poverty, and withholding freedom that we'll get into later. Cubans are healthier and more educated now than they were before the Cuban Revolution. They still lack some basic freedoms that you and I take for granted.
Now that we have covered some of the positive effects of Fidel Castro's reign and the Cuban Revolution, what, if any, were the negative effects of the Cuban Revolution?
As much as Castro tried to bring change through Cuba with his revolution, aside from some of the positives, there were a lot of negatives that came from the Cuban Revolution. One thing that definitely perpetuated throughout his reign in Cuba was poverty, especially for people of color, which goes into another part, which would be discrimination. During our research, we found a lot of resources telling us that there was a lot of discrepancy between Afro-Cubans and whites in Cuba. Castro admits to concerns about the growth of vice and economic inequality, and he acknowledges that dollars flowing from expatriates to family members on the island compounded racial disparities that the revolution did not erase. We have not won the battle against racial equality yet, he said, but vowed we will find the answer. As late as 2019, with a study done between Afro-Cubans and whites, 58% of white Cubans make less than 3,000 convertible pesos, while 95% of Afro-Cubans make less than 3,000 convertible pesos. Also, 50% of white Cubans have a bank account in Cuba, while only 11% of Afro-Cubans have a bank account. Diving even deeper when looking at savings account, more than 62% of Afro-Cubans have less than 100 pesos in their savings account, while 12% of whites have only 12% of whites have less than 100 pesos in their bank account. Aside from economic and racial um, negatives, the Cuban Revolution failed the people in freedom of speech. It's been one of the restricted even to this day. In 2019, when Cuba police raided Pakun activists and beat and detained other protesters. In addition to the lack of freedom, the Cuban government also puts a restriction to creativity. Decree 349 went into effect in 2018, which now requires artists to permission to perform or sell their work. The people of Cuba get their state-issued salaries, sometimes they're the equivalent of less than $1 a day, and because the Cuban government controls the goods, the citizens have to look to the black market to pay extreme prices for their goods. Cubans also have a very limited access to information around them in the world, as slow and limited internet is very expensive and more of a luxury than a common commodity, and the cheaper internet is more censored and controlled.
The Cuban Revolution has been both good and bad for Cuba. However, the politics that accompanied the Cuban Revolution has led to the U.S. placing an embargo on Cuba. How has the U.S. embargo affected the everyday lives of Cubans, and how do Cubans perceive the embargo?
The United States embargo on Cuba has affected the citizens in a variety of ways, including in the realms of public health and education. Between 2004 and '05, the U.S. embargo reportedly cost Cuba $75 million in damages and public health costs due to the licensing process Cuba has to go through to purchase U.S. or U.S. subsidiary manufactured pharmaceuticals. Between 1989 and '94, there was likewise an 18 to 25% decrease in access to protein and calorie sources, which led to low birth weights to newborns and pregnant mothers struggling to gain adequate weight. The embargo has also raised the costs of education because it removes Cuba's access to supplies manufactured in the United States. For example, instruments for art schools had to be purchased in other countries at a 16% extra cost rate. The embargo has taken away the ability for United States organizations and charities and churches to give aid to Cuban schools as well. The Cuban people have had a negative reaction towards the United States embargo on their goods. The current president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, says that the U.S. embargo limits what they can achieve and calls it a cruel and genocidal punishment. The livelihoods and fates of the Cuban citizens very much are almost dependent on the U.S. embargo, and if it were to be lifted, their lives would be vastly improved. However, the Cuban people are not expecting an embargo to be lifted in the near future. Their lives are very much in the hands of the United States president. Cuban human rights activists such as Yoani Sanchez says that it is impossible for Cubans to buy staples like eggs or cooking oils without turning to the underground market. This is because the embargo prevents Cubans from obtaining the goods that are in the United States. Interestingly, there has been a public opinion shift about the embargo in recent years. As recent as 2014, one reliable university poll found that in 2014 a large majority, being 71%, believe that the United States embargo of Cuba has not worked at all or has not worked very well, and 68% of those surveyed support the restoration of diplomatic relations with Cuba. What's interesting is that younger generations of Cuban Americans have moved away from their parents' and grandparents' hardline stance against Cuba and have formed moderate views and organizations. The same poll showed that 90% of younger generations support normalization of relationships. In this last segment, I will talk about my own personal trip to Cuba, which I took in January 2019. I was in Havana, Cuba for a day, and it was a great experience. I will quickly highlight as many aspects of my trip as I can. I was able to visit Cuba during a short time period when there wasn't a complete ban on tourism to Cuba. I was able to visit on a cruise ship, and it was deemed a educational opportunity. I think that was the loophole how I was able to go into the country. What surprised me the most and possibly offers my greatest respect to the Cuban people is their lack of a materialistic culture, as in the sense that if you look at the US, we have people in society who are glued to phones, fixed on materialism, and really dictates a lot of your life. Seeing the Cuban people, they didn't really have a culture of materialism to where they were attached to any particular thing or item. They go on without their day, without phones. Many people, whenever I was on the tour bus, are just kind of in the street celebrating life. There's a lot of activity going on in the city. People are out celebrating with families. And really it's just a vibrant area that you wouldn't really see, I would say, in the US. I don't really know what to compare it to. It was a very unique experience. Traveling in the city, you really got the whole communist Cuba feel. Wherever you turned a street corner or wherever you looked, you were most likely to see some form of propaganda. Whether that was Shaw Guerrera or maybe Fidel Castro, there are many symbolisms dating back to the revolution. They try to really promote a strong sense of nationalism in Cuba. Even being in the city and exploring the suburbs of the city and outside the main Havana areas, you really got a sense of the poverty that the Cuban people faced. I remember going into a restaurant, and it was a very nice restaurant. It was meant for tourists, but whenever you went to the restroom, there was no toilet paper, and it was better that you brought a napkin or something with you. I also remember hearing that if you went to any local shops in the area, it was best that you brought 25 cents, as in sometimes it would cost 25 cents for a single square piece of toilet paper. Being outside the city on the tour bus, we saw a lot of destroyed infrastructure, rundown buildings, and it kind of makes you realize of the lack of economic support that Cuba does get in foreign aid. The Cubans also have a lot of cars from the 1950s. It's probably a lot due to the US embargo, but there's even some 1960s and 70s Soviet Union and German made vehicles that you can tell are not US made. And the cars, for the most part, are used as tourist attractions, although some are still used for transportation around the islands. Other highlights of my trip included visiting a cigar and rum shop. You can't really go to Cuba without buying cigars. I also visited an art district. I went to a marketplace, and I got to tour the city some more. A couple last interesting facts about Cuba is that they have a very low crime rate, and Cuba is very tough on crime. A street mugging can land a person, I think I remember hearing, about 20 years in jail. And Havana itself has a very large population of wildcats that roam around the city. I have pictures, and kind of just touring throughout the area, you would see probably a cat at every street corner.